Morning, everybody. Morning. Thank you all for joining us in Room B this morning. My name's Peter Davis, and what we're going to do for the next 40 minutes is talk to you about something very big that's coming down the tracks next year, and something that is going to affect every single one of you. It's going to affect every hospitality business in the UK, whether you are a pub with food, whether you are a restaurant, whether you are a hotel. All of you are going to be affected by something that we call the Employment (brackets Allocation of Tips) Act. Okay, this is a piece of legislation that has already been passed by Parliament and is already on the statute book. But do not panic, you have not missed the boat, because although the legislation is here, it hasn't come into effect yet. And what I'm going to do this morning is talk with you, firstly, about what's involved in this legislation, and secondly, how we may be able to help you with that. For those of you who don't know me, and there are some familiar faces in the room here, for those of you who don't, my name is Peter Davis. I am the Managing Director of WMT Trunk Master Services. I've been working in the sphere of tips, service charge and trunk for over 20 years now. My guilty secret is that when I was young and foolish, I worked for the Inland Revenue. It was a long time ago. I've repaid my debt to society, but I dealt with these issues for HMRC back in the day, so I feel that I've got a unique understanding of all of the laws and all of the regulations around this. Okay, you will notice there is a big asterisk on the screen. Why is that? Because not everything is absolutely final yet, and things may change. Although this legislation has been passed by Parliament, it will not come into effect until an accompanying code of practice has been publicly consulted on and has also been passed by Parliament. Crystal ball as to when that might be, I think most likely is probably June of 2024. But the code of practice is late. It's now 5 months late, and the clock for implementation won't start until the government publish it. That said, we already know and we already understand what the fundamental principles of this legislation is, and they are not going to change, only some of the fine detail. Okay, this is a bit like what did the Romans ever do for us, but there are 9 main principles to this legislation, and in the next 30 minutes I am going to try and run through all of them. So if I go a little quickly, please excuse me, but come and see us at lunch or later on for some more detail. Okay, first thing that the legislation does is to say, okay, what types of money might you receive or might your customers pay, and which of those monies are within the scope of these rules and which are not. And it introduces 2 new concepts: an employer-received tip and a worker-received tip. Everything will fall into one of those 2 categories. There is no third category. Okay? Now, an employer-received tip is anything that your customers pay that becomes your legal property, passes through your hands, you exercise control over, or you arrange to be dealt with and paid to a third party. Okay, so translate that into everyday language. What does it mean? Discretionary service charges, gratuities paid on a card by a customer, maybe in addition to or in place of discretionary service charges. Cash tips, if you control what happens to them. So maybe if your staff are required to pool cash and it's then amalgamated with other tips and dealt with centrally in an organised system. Tips that are paid by app when the money doesn't go directly to the worker. So there's lots of apps on the market, they all work in different ways. Some of them, the money will go in full directly to a member of staff. they are not employer-received tips. Some of them will go into a pool where they are shared and split out based on some formula, but the physical cash is never held by you. It maybe goes direct via a QR code, or it's split off at the by the EPOS system. They are employer-received tips. So essentially, the only things that you can say, nothing to do with me, tips on app that go directly to the member of staff. Cash tips where a member of staff may say, thank you very much, put it in their pocket and it's theirs, or they will share them out informally at the end of the night. Tip the jar up, split the money out, everyone goes home with it. Okay, those are worker-received tips, and we can forget those. Everything else is an employer-received tip. You will be under a statutory obligation to make sure that 100% of those tips, those employer-received tips, are paid to your staff. You will not be allowed to deduct, charge, retain, or offset any costs at all against that money. So what that means is you will need to bear the costs in future of things like credit card commissions and fees, bank charges, payroll cost. If you don't use trunk, employer national insurance contributions and employer pension contributions, you will no longer be allowed to net those off of the pool of money, okay? If things like card commissions and fees are taken off the money before you actually receive it, you will have to make good that money. So, very, very important, every penny that your customers pay has to go to your staff, okay? There is now a timescale in which this money must be paid to your staff. And by paid, we mean the physical act of it leaving your bank account and landing in their bank account. So we're not talking about book entries or accounting entries. It's a real physical thing. And the money must be paid by the end of the month following the month in which it was received by you. So if I went into one of your properties today, had a lovely time, chose to pay a service charge or chose to tip the staff on a card, that money will need to be with your workers by the 31st of December, the end of the following month. So, what that means is, unlike now, what we won't be able to do is to keep a large sum of money back from a very strong trading period and then release it to the staff maybe many months later in a quiet trading period. We will not be allowed to do that anymore. We need to have a look at when our payroll dates are if you pay your staff a month in arrears. So, for example, if you pay the money that your customers pay in September and you pay that in October's payroll and payday is the 5th of November, you have a problem because that will be too late. Okay. We will still be able to carry money forward from one month to the next, but each month we will have to pay out any of last month's money that's remaining, and we may carry forward some of the new money to next month. Note, the legislation is not retrospective. What that means is any amounts of money that your customers pay before the date that this takes effect, but which hasn't yet gone to staff, is not covered by this timeline. Okay? So it is only money paid on or after the day it kicks in. Now, if you operate a single-site business, you're one property or one location, you can have a snooze for the next minute. If you have multiple outlets in your business, multiple sites, this is very, very important. You will also be under a statutory duty to make sure that the money is paid to people at the place where it was generated. So, if I have, for example, a group of 5 restaurants, what I will not be allowed to do is take money that was generated in site number 1 and pay it to a member of staff who works in site number 2. I will not be allowed to do that. It must go to the people in the place where it was generated. As with every good rule, there is an exception. And the exception is what we call non-public places of business. And they are defined as places where there is no face-to-face interaction between your customers and your staff. And the examples that are given by government are head offices, dark kitchens, central production units, things like that. And it will still be possible to take a fair proportion of the money generated in a trading site and pay it to somebody who works in a non-public place of business. We will still be allowed to do that. Now, those of you who do have properties that maybe have multiple F&B outlets or departments within. So you may have a restaurant, you may have 2 bars, you may have room service, you may have banqueting and events, all of which generate tip, scratch, service charge. Okay? Is that a single place of business or is that multiple places of business? The answer is, are they all under one roof, in one property, with the same postal address, for example? If so, that is a single place. If any of your businesses are geographically diverse, it is not a single place of business. Agency workers. Now, if you ask me to lay money on what is the most likely part of this legislation to change before it comes in, this will be it. Why? Because it is a complete and utter unworkable dog's breakfast, as the civil servants responsible have been told many times. Okay. Agency staff at the moment generally do not get a share of tips and trunk. That is not because we're horrible and mean and don't like them. That is because they are not our employees, they are not on our payroll, and there are big problems with paying money to people who aren't on our payroll. What the legislation says, as it stands, though, is that we will not be allowed to exclude or discriminate against agency workers, and that they must receive the same share of tips as comparable directly employed staff. Okay. So, if I have 2 bartenders in my business, one of whom is directly employed by me and one of whom has been supplied by an agency, unless there is another good reason why not, the agency bartender will have to get the same share as the directly employed bartender. Okay. Now, this causes a number of problems, one of which is that it could easily result in the agency worker actually ending up earning more money than the directly employed member of staff. Because agency workers don't get trunk, agencies have factored that in to the pay rates that they pay to their workers, which clearly, ultimately, they charge back to all of you. If the agency is going to carry on paying their worker the same wages, but you will now be obliged to give them a share of this money, they will end up earning more than your directly employed staff. And in that case, why wouldn't everyone just go and work for an agency? That money that we may have to give to an agency worker might currently be being given to a directly employed team member. So we'll have to take it off them to give it to the agency worker. And because of the practicalities of how this will work, so what government have essentially said is you will need to tell your agency what share of tips their workers have got. They will need to invoice that to you. Okay, that now means there's VAT on that. Okay. When the agency pays that money to their worker, Revenue and Customs view is that agencies can't run trunk systems. So when the agency pays the worker will pay national insurance on it, and I don't think any of you would think that the agency will swallow the employer's NI cost. That will be coming back to you as well. Don't even ask what it means for workplace pensions. Yeah, okay. It's a complete unworkable mess. We hope that the government has listened to a lot of the lobbying that's been done since this bill came in and changes some of this before it actually takes effect. Okay. Sorry, can I ask a quick question? You can if it's quick. Yeah.
That agency invoice that comes through, you will be able to charge that to the drop. You get the invoice from the agency saying this is how much the service
Essentially, yes, because the trunk will have awarded a certain amount of money to that person, and instead of it being paid to them through the payroll system, you will pass it on to the agency. Yeah, on that. Okay, now, here is a very, very important point. Many hotels traditionally have not used trunk systems to manage service charges. Hotels traditionally have either said, we will deal with this as a company service charge scheme because we want to control it and we want to manage it. What businesses may have done, again, quite legitimately, is to say, okay, we will take this service charge revenue, we will treat that as a credit to our P&L, and actually what that does is help offset the labour cost that we also have in our P&L because we pay our staff full market rate salaries, okay? There's nothing wrong with that, okay? That's the way many, particularly hotels, have operated. You'll still be able to keep doing that, but as I'm going to come on to, there's a couple of issues. But what the new legislation says is once this has taken effect, it will not be possible, even by consent, for an employee to agree to reduce their wages or their contractual entitlement from you in return for receiving tips, trunk, service charge, a specific amount, a greater amount. Now, if you're not running trunk at the moment and you decided, we want to, excellent, good, but you will have to go through a consultation process with your employees because those company service charge schemes are all contractual. Yes, they are, even though you may say to your staff they're not. They are, okay? The new law says you will not be allowed to do that once this takes effect. You will not be allowed to say to a member of staff, will you give up a certain part of your contractual right in return for being in a trunk system, which is not part of your contractual T's and C's. So if you are not using trunk, you have a once and forever decision to make before this comes in. Because if you decide to stay as you are, that's fine, that's okay, but it will be nigh on impossible for you to change tack later. This is employment legislation. What that means is that there are obligations on you and there are rights for your workers. Okay. You have a statutory obligation to ensure that 100% of the money is paid to your staff within the prescribed timescale at the place where it was generated in a manner which is fair. You will need to have a written policy about how you ensure this is done. And you will have to give that policy proactively to every member of staff who works in the place where money is generated. Okay. If you don't do this, it's a one-way trip to the employment tribunal. Your employees will be able to go to a tribunal. Your employees will be able to say, I want to know how much money in tips and service charges were paid by customers at the place I work last month. And you will be obliged to tell them, okay? Now, you might say, we're not going to do that, that's commercially sensitive. Or you're going to say, we're not going to do that because maybe we're a listed business. The government don't care. They have given this right. Every single one of your employees can come to you and say, I want to know, and you will be obliged to tell them. What they are not allowed to ask for is personal data. So an employee could not come to you and say, I want to know how much my manager is getting in trunk. Yeah, because that's personal data. You're not obliged to give them that, and they're not entitled to see it. Now, if you don't keep these records and policies, if you don't give them to your staff, if they don't show what they're meant to show, like I say, your employee can go to an employment tribunal. And if the tribunal find in their favour, they can make an award of up to £5,000. And the tribunal can also make an award for every other similarly affected worker, even if those other workers have not brought a claim to the tribunal themselves. So it's a bit like a class action. So the risks of an adverse employment tribunal are very, very large. Okay, some good news here. Trunk arrangements, the government likes them. The government believes and supports what they call fair, transparent, and well-managed trunk arrangements. Okay. Now, when we say a valid trunk arrangement, what do we mean? We mean that it satisfies revenue and customs rules for being outside of the scope of national insurance. And those rules are not changing. There is no change to taxation as a result of this. And what the legislation says is if you have one of these valid independent trunk arrangements, that will have an automatic presumption of fairness attached to it. So you will have complied with your statutory duty to act fairly simply by having this trunk arrangement in place. Now, if you don't have a trunk arrangement, if you decide to say, okay, we continue to want to manage this, we accept that we now have to bear the cost of the employer's NI, but we want to manage it. Okay? You can still do that. But remember that written policy I talked about a few minutes ago? That written policy will now need to contain an explanation of how you deal with the money and why it is fair for you to behave in the way that you are. And if your employees don't like that, or let's say we've got an employee that doesn't agree, I don't think that's fair, I don't like that. And they come to you and you might say, well, I'm really sorry, but you know, I think most people are happy with it. I think it's fair. The employee will be able to go to an employment tribunal and they will be able to challenge whether you are acting fairly before the employment tribunal. Okay? Now, think about your teams and think about your workforce and hand on heart, tell me that you don't think that a single member of staff will ever think it's unfair. People will try it on. With the trunk arrangement in place, if that employee came to you and said, it's not fair, your answer is going to be, I'm very sorry to hear that, but it's nothing to do with me. Go speak to the trunk master. And the employee has no right of redress to you, and no right of redress to an employment tribunal, and no legal right of redress to the trunk master. Caveat, if we're doing something really bad, like discriminating against people or abusive position by the trunk master, yes, you've got to step in. But in all normal circumstances, remember that shield, it's got fair written on it, and the employee cannot challenge you. Okay, the government are very clear, yeah, okay, it is not your responsibility to share the money out and decide it with a trunk arrangement, and you are not responsible for it. This is the reason why we're still waiting. There is a statutory code of practice coming, and the reason for that is a word I've mentioned several times, and that word is fair. I haven't told you what it means, deliberately, because the legislation doesn't say. It can't. Legislation cannot deal in subjective concepts, and fair is a very subjective concept. So what the government are going to be doing is publishing a code of practice that sets out their view of what fair and transparent means. It was originally expected in June, then it was promised in September, and as of about 40 minutes ago, it still hadn't come out. So it has been delayed. Okay. Now, you will need to have regard for this code. That means you will need to read it and understand it. That means that your arrangements cannot be a million miles away from it, but you do not have to slavishly follow every aspect of it, because the government has said it will be about standards and principles, not micromanagement. They have said there will be no one-size-fits-all option, okay? The government will give examples of how you can behave fairly, but they will not be exhaustive. If you have another way in your business that meets the same standard, great, fine. And when the bill went through the House of Lords, the government's minister in the Lords said that the view of the government was that the vast majority of businesses were already dealing with things in a way which was fair, and it was the government's wish that that would remain undisturbed. but we haven't seen it yet, so we don't know how true to that it is. Okay, let me just give you a very quick run through, because having told you about all of these issues, one of the things that you may be thinking is, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this and how are we going to manage? Okay, currently I have the privilege of acting as trunk master for approximately 950 businesses across the UK. They employ about 60,000 staff. I don't do it all single-handedly. I have a lovely team of about 30 in Hertfordshire, some of whom are here today. They do all the hard work. I just drink coffee and speak to people on that. And it's across the whole range of hospitality. So independents, pubs with food, high street brands, members clubs, hotels, fine dining, Michelin standard restaurants as well. Okay. One of the things that you've seen, Trunkbox, okay? So it's a software solution that we provide to our clients, but big buzz phrase everyone knows, software as a service. It's not what we go in for. We go in for software with a service. We have human beings, we employ professionals. Professionals run and manage things. The software is a tool, it's not the be-all and end-all. Okay. And what it does is it allows you to have fair, transparent, legitimate trunk arrangements that satisfy revenue and customs, will be in line with the new legislation, in line with all the stuff like GDPR and everything else that we have to as well. We're very excited about this. We've been working on this for a number of years because we've known what way the wind's blowing. At the moment, you've essentially got two choices as to how you can manage things. So there are software solutions out there that are aimed at you, and they are often integrated within things like time and attendance systems. So systems like, for example, Fourth Hospitality, S4, all of the others, they will have a basic calculation tool. Okay. It's really a part of payroll process, and it is used and viewed by the people in your business involved in that process. So generally, it's not used by, and there is no visibility there to most of your team, the people who are receiving this money, but who aren't involved in the process. There are some solutions that are aimed directly at members of staff, and they are generally app-based solutions. Some of them work on QR codes. Some of them work on splitting a transaction at the point it goes through the EPOS system on that. Okay. What those systems do is provide a lot more visibility to the employee, but it takes all the visibility away from you. And in fact, you'll have no visibility over the money or what happens to it, because that will have gone off to the third party. Yes, the employee can often draw down their money quicker than waiting for payroll, which may be at the end of the month. But there will always be a cost for that. Somebody will pay the cost, you, your members of staff. Okay. I think our view has always been that you and your staff both have a legitimate business interest in this, in making sure it's done properly, legitimately, fairly. Okay. Trunkbox uses data from most of the leading time and attendance systems. At the moment, it sucks that in as imports, and it's nice and clever and intelligent and knows what it's looking for. Next year, we'll be working on integration, so it will pull information through APIs. It is already integrated with many of the point-of-sale systems that are used, particularly in restaurants. So it can pull from their details of service charge revenues and grats. That means it can verify 100% of that money is going to staff. It's not disappearing off into the ether. Okay. No more emails, no more spreadsheets so last decade. No physical having to give the money to a third party. Okay. The money will still be paid through your payroll system. It will leave your bank account and go to your employee's bank account. You will have complete visibility over it, as you should. Okay. And it offers lots and lots of different ways of doing it, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. Every business works slightly differently. If I'm a member of staff, I'm going to be entitled to have more transparency in the future. And I think your staff will want to know more about this. How's it work? How's my money worked out? Who's doing it? How do I ask them questions or talk to them? Yeah, they will. And one of the things for this is that it will be dealt with impartially. They have the smartphone app. They get the money on the same payslip. That's very important because that means if they want loans and credit and tenancies, mortgages even, lenders will take the money into account if there is a degree of stability and certainty in that. Okay? If it's on a separate payslip, no lender is going to be interested in it. And actually, the way that the sector has moved over the last few years is very much trunk has become more fixed and set, and that will still happen in the new world, and that has allowed people to get credit and mortgages and things like that. Okay. All of the information that your staff are going to be entitled to get, that is delivered to them through the app. They can view it, print it, save it, download it, digitally sign it as well. Very important if somebody says later, you never told me that. Oh, yes, we did. Okay. It will give you a lot of detail and insight and analytics because trunk and service charge is just representative of what's going on in your wider business. Okay? So it will give you a lot of analytics, a lot of data. You can very much bespoke permission who gets to see what, okay? Who's involved in it. So if you've got 2 restaurants in your property, you might want the GM of one site to be able to see what's going on in their part of the business, but not to be able to see anything else. Whereas if you're the FD, you want to see everything. That's fine. It's happy with that. Essentially, here's the journey. The guest pays the tip or service charge. The money comes to you. It goes into your bank account. Trunkbox will get the details from your repost system. There will be other relevant data, maybe off your time and attendance system, that gets sucked in. Our team, our lovely human beings, will work all of this out. They are here for you. It comes back to you for review, comment. Nothing goes to payroll until you're happy with it. Okay? Your employee on payday gets a little push notification on their app with big breakdown and details of all of their money as well. Okay, that's very, very small. We are going to, I think, circulate these. But essentially, you know, just saying all the things it does. We're very excited about this. The strapline I use is changing the face of trunk forever, and I really, really believe this. It's very much about giving you the comfort of having things managed in a way which is legal, fair, meets all of your obligations, keeps revenue and customs happy. In the 20 years I've been doing this, I've never had revenue and customs be unhappy with the scheme that we manage for clients. We've never had an employment tribunal give an adverse finding on one either. Okay? That's because we do things properly. And it gives your employees visibility and certainty. Key takeaway message. If you have not already considered how this legislation will apply to you, you need to start now. Even if you say, we think we're good guys, we already give all the money to our staff, you will still need to have written policies, all of that sort of thing, and a system for dealing with it. You will also need to make sure, if you don't want trunk, you need to make that once and forever decision, okay? And that's very important, and that will take time to put in place. But you need to decide that now, because once the new law comes in, it will be very, very difficult to change. I'm pretty much stuck to time, which for those of you who know me is a pretty rare event. I think we have got a couple of minutes, literally. If anyone has any quick questions, yeah, we've got 5 minutes, we've got 3 minutes on that. If not, at lunchtime, we will be over in the far corner. When they take these walls away, we'll be over in the far corner. Come and say hello, come and talk to us. Other than that, and I'm being given some eyes, thank you for coming along this morning. I hope that's been interesting. I hope it's been useful. I hope it has just started a thought process for you. So other than that, enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you for coming. And if any of you haven't got a bag with some of our lovely branded things in there, please shout, because we got loads of them.
And a brochure about chocolates.
Yeah, that should be in there as well. There's a brochure in there, there's a nice mug, there's a pen as well, and a bag. So, yeah, please do. Trunkbox.com, lots more information on there as well. Please have a look. Thank you all very much.